I am clearly going to be talking a little bit about what we need to do in terms of water measurement in the Logan River Observatory. But I first got asked to provide some background on me. And that is always an interesting thing. They're like, how did you end up where you are today? And I thought, that's a good question. So bear with me. I will talk about water, I promise. Okay, so I am from a very small town in southeastern Idaho. As you drive north on I-15, you drive through this town. Now you know somebody from Ingham, Idaho. It is one of the few places where there is a turn in I-15. I spent my years growing up outside. I spent time camping and hunting and fishing with my family, and I was kind of one of those kids you wouldn't find inside very often. If I wasn't in the classroom, I was generally found hanging upside down in the schoolyard. And I was one of those children that I think it was fair to say that teachers didn't know what to do with me because I was fidgety enough that they actually put me in a desk that was attached to a chair, because otherwise I was upside down with my chair and maybe hurting other people around me by knocking things down. So over time, my parents decided that maybe gymnastics would be a good thing for me because I was always hanging off of something. And this kept me busy throughout my undergraduate years. After that, my husband and I spent most of our free time and money basically recreating outdoors. And this looked like anything from snow skiing, whether it was cross-country skiing or downhill skiing, to boating, water skiing, fishing, camping. But a lot of our time was actually spent on mountain bikes. And ironically, my husband crashed this last week, but we spent a lot of time on mountain bikes in our headwater watersheds and throughout the West. As we did this, while this doesn't seem relevant to water, it was during my master's and my PhD that we spent this time in these areas. And of course, studying water, I spent time watching how the various water bodies responded over time and space. And oftentimes, I was looking around for where water was and where it went. Well, to the point that I often crashed trying to watch water instead of the trail itself. So this time spent out in these watersheds was pretty fundamental to developing my research philosophy. And that is that we need to have good field measurements to guide modeling and decision making. I was learning how to be a modeler, but I realized without data, this was a very potentially dangerous activity. We need good data. So let's start talking about water in the West. We know that we have limited water that's uncertain, particularly in a changing climate. We know that there are lots of competing interests. That could be agriculture versus development versus environmental needs. When we think about this, we start looking at population growth and the development associated with population growth, and this kind of growth continues to put pressure on our water resources. When we think about water in the state of Utah, so we have growth that's not just occurring in Utah, it's happening throughout the West, but when we think about the state of Utah and water in Utah, we now take the problems within the western US and we actually start adding complexity because we have a terminal drying lake in the middle. And this leads to even more questions about competing interests when you have to consider the Great Salt Lake additionally. So when we think, kind of zooming in, if we start to think about local issues, there are many different local issues that are becoming, that are concerns to local people living in those areas. For example, in Cache Valley, the Cache Water District has essentially said that water demands are going to outpace availability in the near future. This becomes concerning because there's uncertainty about how to address these issues as we continue to grow. So water scarcity in the West has been something that has been in the news constantly over the last few years. This can be about Hyde Park and potential problems with their wells not producing enough water, or their springs producing enough water, to the Colorado River Basin and the complex issues associated with that. So everybody is paying attention to the water issues these days, but how do we change how we manage and use water? That's the big question. So we know there's a problem, but what do we do about it? And I will claim that we cannot, and remind us that we cannot manage what we don't measure. If we don't know what we have, we're going to have a very difficult time figuring out how to manage water if we don't know how much we have. To provide a quick insight into the idea of gauging or gauging rivers and streams across the US, I've provided this figure. Now this figure has a lot going on, but essentially each one of these different graphs represent a state. And what it shows is the trends in USGS stream gauging from 1890 to present, and it's actually to 2016. But what it shows is the number of gauges in each state over time, and how that changes from year to year. And if you look at something, excuse me, don't look there yet. Oh, no, come back. I can't make it go back. Okay, I'm going the wrong way. Are you ready? We're gonna try this again. If you look up in the right, up in the corner, up in here, does this work? No. Up at Maine, up in the right-hand corner, you'll see that in Maine, we've had this increase in gauging stations over the last while. If you look in places in the West, for example, in Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, you'll see that we went from some pretty significant numbers of gauging stations to relatively low numbers in the last couple of decades. This says something about a state's funding priorities, in part because these USGS gauging stations are not only funded by federal dollars, they're also funded by state dollars. And so we have de-emphasized our need for gauging over the last few decades in the West, and now we're in a bit of a crisis. So why do we need to measure what's happening in watersheds? And not only in one location in a watershed, but in many locations in a watershed. I'm going to provide a quick example of a study that highlights the complexity of flow paths between two canals and a river. So this is the Blacksmith Fork River, the Nibley-Blacksmith Fork Canal, and the Hiram-Blacksmith Fork Canal. This is a pretty typical scenario that we see at least in the state of Utah, where we take quite a bit of water out of our rivers and we put it in canals and distribute it across the landscape. The Logan River Observatory, a crew within the observatory, went out and they collected flow information at all of these different points. And so we're trying to measure the amount of water at each location as you move through each of these systems, and that can include, can you see that very small dot? From the downstream or the upstream locations up through canals, and the river is actually flowing upwards, so up to your left. In this situation, we essentially were able to take these measurements and figure out how these canals were connected to each other via the subsurface and how the canals were connected to the river via the subsurface, meaning that we're actually transferring water from each of these water bodies to the next water body, because there is water flows downslope, and these happen to be higher than each other. So in this situation, the arrows show the original location, or the color represents where it came from, and the beginning color, and then the end color of the arrow says where it's headed. And the numbers in these arrows are in cubic feet per second, or CFS, and this says something about the amount of flow transferred from each canal system to each other or to the river itself. So if we look at the Blacksmith Fork, right below the Nibley-Blacksmith Fork Canal diversion, this picture shows a relatively dry channel. There's a little bit of water left in there, but not much. If we move further down the Blacksmith Fork, we now have a dry channel because the water has essentially gone into the groundwater. And finally, if we move to the end of the system, all of a sudden we have water in our river again. And this water in the river is due to these leaking canals. And if we look at this, we would say we have lost 8 cubic feet per second from our canals. That's the total amount lost over this entire stretch in the Nibley and Hiram-Blacksmith Fork canals. But we gained 5 of this in this very short stretch back in the river, showing this transfer of water from one system to the next. This kind of understanding is really important to help us value the need for measurements and make sure that we understand that we're dealing with very complex systems. So when it comes to measurement, long-term measurements, there's a lot of challenges. First of all, it's logistically difficult to collect flow gauging information. Seems like it shouldn't be that hard. We should be able to go out and get a measurement, and it's not a big deal. But maintaining these stations is extremely difficult. It's also difficult to manage the data and give that data back to the public readily. So those are all challenges. However, the major challenge is securing long-term funding. And that's because oftentimes we tend to value hydrologic data when we have a crisis. And we want to have that historical information, but we're not willing to necessarily pay to keep that historical information coming in, because when we have plenty of water, there sometimes doesn't feel to be the urgency. So I would argue that relatively small investments in long-term monitoring can give you quite a big return on that investment. Utah is rare in investing in long-term data collection in the Logan River. In 2018, the state legislature was visionary, and they invested in a relatively dense long-term measurements within the Logan River. The idea was to facilitate research to better understand semi-arid and snow-dominated hydrologic systems, to improve our understanding of highly managed systems with significant human influences, which once we get out of our mountains and into our valleys, all of a sudden we have significant human influences, and also to facilitate water-related education. This led to the establishment or the continuation of the Logan River Observatory, which is a collection of instrumentation in a watershed. I've had people say, what is an observatory? And it's essentially a lot of different hydrologic instruments in a watershed to help you be able to observe the system as a whole. This observatory was built on the initial infrastructure funded by an NSF EPSCoR grant called iUtah. It was a statewide grant. And essentially, this has resulted in the observatory becoming a bit of a test bed for a lot of different, some insight into Utah-specific problems. So what does the Logan River Observatory do for the university, local and state water management, and larger scale research? First of all, as you would expect, we collect data. And data collection is a very important part of what we do, because these data can be instrumental in various aspects of not just management, but also in the context of research. So in this picture, we have dots showing gauging stations in the canyon portion of the Logan River watershed, which is the brown watershed. Below that is the Blacksmith Fork watershed, which is a tributary to the Logan River, but it's a large tributary, so I have it delineated out. In the canyon, we have 10 flow gauging stations and 8 water quality stations, with another pending station coming online. In the valley, we have 7 flow gauging stations and 7 water quality stations, with a couple more pending. And you might kind of wonder, well, why are there so many gauges down in the valley portion? And it's because this is where we have drastically altered how the hydrology works by our human infrastructure. On top of that, we also have climate stations. We're getting there. We have climate stations. Clearly, my button clicking is not great. We have 5 climate stations up in the canyon and 1 in the valley, and this is to supplement other existing climate stations that are around, including snowtail stations. We also have, the Division of Water Rights has diversion gauging locations where we are able to keep track of what is taken out of the river at these major locations. And on top of that, we have 2 very long-term USGS gauging stations at the mouth of Logan Canyon and in the Blacksmith Fork River. These are important for this very long-term understanding of what's happening in these systems. With this sort of dense measurement, it's very unique. This is one of the most highly instrumented watersheds in the western US. But this allows us to ask some very important questions, such as, can we track very small amounts of water moving through highly managed and diverted watersheds? How much water can we track, and how well can we track it? Or, does the Bear River Range geology impact our groundwater availability for our rivers and our valleys? These are big questions and important questions when it comes to understanding not just what's happening in Logan, but also what's happening throughout the state. And when we start thinking about delivery of water to the Great Salt Lake, this can become critical. The other aspect is data management and distribution. When you collect a large quantity of data, and we have many stations running 365 days a year and many data streams, we have to think about data management and dissemination. It's a critical aspect of this. If we collect data and people can't access it, it's a problem. So people, most of us think, well, data management's no big deal. You send somebody out, they take some measurements, that little white box there, it does something to the data, and then it shows up on your iPhone. Ta-da! And it's QA/QC'd, it's just perfect. But in reality, there's a lot that happens behind the scenes where we get this data, we get it back into certain locations, we're able to interface with very complex databases where we're able to manage and then also store and maintain the data to be able to provide this data to different people on the ground. So going back 1 second, if I can figure out how to go backwards, one important thing here is Jeff Horsborough. He's a co-director of the Logan River Observatory. He has been leading the development of many of these hydroinformatics tools. These tools are being used nationwide for data management in the world of hydrologic systems, but now they're also being used in the context of the Division of Water Rights and helping them deal with some of their highly diverse data sets and complex data sets that they are now trying to reorganize to make them more accessible to the public. So besides data, the Logan River Observatory also focuses on education. Our goal is to facilitate state water-related workforce needs. So the students that we spend time with, both in the classroom, but in graduate and undergraduate research experiences, and actually our Logan River Observatory technicians, which have been very critical to the development of the Logan River Observatory. Our hope is that by having hands-on experiences and living in this watershed, but also seeing the complexity of the hydrologic system, that we are able to help facilitate state-related needs. So why does having something like the Logan River Observatory matter? First, the Logan River Observatory supports fundamental research to advance hydrologic understanding and measurement abilities. We also work on other topics. We have people working on ecological questions, but fundamentally we have focused on hydrologic understanding. I'm going to show a video of one of the ongoing federally funded research projects that's working on low-cost stream gauging techniques, and this is a quick video from Sierra Young.
So as part of this project, we're looking to integrate cameras as sensors as part of the Logan River Observatory to help us monitor hydrologic variables such as water level and surface velocity, but also gain an enhanced understanding that you can get by looking at an image of the site that you might not be able to get with a number from a sensor. And exploring alternative solutions such as edge computing, where we process video and imagery actually at the site, and then we're sending those processed results as numeric data over a network connection where we maybe don't have, a robust Wi-Fi connection at that site. Being able to collaborate with the LRO and leverage their existing infrastructure has been instrumental for our project, because we need the data and the information to be able to validate the information that we're getting from images and video. So without the LRO, we would be on our own with installing sensors and instrumentation, so we can readily kind of leverage this infrastructure and expedite the development of our image and video processing algorithms.
Besides supporting various research needs and research projects, the LRO also supports local needs ranging from water management to environmental sustainability. I'm going to show another quick video of Nate Doggs of the Cache Water District highlighting the Logan River Observatory involvement in a PL 566 project that's focused on potentially piping a Crockett Canal, which is a very large diversion off of the Logan River. And they have had some needs that we've been able to help with.
I think the Logan River Observatory on the statewide basis is now being used as a model for what every stream in the state needs. Currently we're working on a project right now, the Logan River Watershed Environmental Impact Statement, looking at pressurizing 10 canal companies that divert water out of the Logan River. Crockett Irrigation Company has been looking at improvements to their canal system for well over a decade. very hard to maintain. We're looking at a portion of it right here, and having some of that water data off the canal systems, not just off the river, gives us an idea of how much water is being lost to seepage between the diversion and other points in the canal system. And knowing that and where that seepage water is going has been critical as part of this watershed project we're doing, to know that if we pipe all the canals, how does that affect the Logan River itself? So that data that they're collecting on the canals is equally important as part of the project. It is a great tool for Cache County, but it's also a tool for the state to look at of how it should be done.
To provide a little bit of insight on this project, I'm going to just talk about the impacted portion of the Logan River when it comes to this project. Up here, I'm going to try to keep close to this mic. Up in the right-hand corner, you can see that there is the Logan River Observatory site at the Utah Water Research Lab. Down in the bottom, you have the Logan River Observatory site at Main Street. We have 65 CFS up at the Water Lab and about 14 CFS down at Main Street. So there's a big change that occurs through this section. And the question is, what is causing this? Well, we went in and we took different measurements at different locations, and you can start to see the variability as we move downstream in this watershed. We go from 65 CFS to 60 to 66 to 9, and we go back up to approximately 14. So what is happening in this area? Well, if you put the human infrastructure on top, the diversions and the canals, you can see that there's a lot happening right around the river. In the darker blue, you can see that is the Crockett Canal. We take about 60 CFS out of the river at that location. And after that diversion, we don't have a measurement exactly right below it, but there's only about 5 or 6 CFS that comes in. And then we see this, what we call gaining system, as we move downstream. So we also see that there are some drains that are in green, and you see that there are return flows. These numbers all represent small amounts of cubic feet per second of water coming back to the system. So it has to do with inefficiencies in this canal system that we continue to gain water as we move downstream. However, this shows just what's happening on the surface. Similar to what we showed in the Blacksmith Fork, there's also groundwater influences. It looks like some of these numbers have been smashed, unfortunately. There are groundwater influences that are also occurring where we have gaining sections and losing sections. So this goes back to this idea of seepage that Nate talked about in the video, and how important the seepage from the canals and these return flows from these canals are on maintaining in-stream flows in the Logan River. Another key element here is, as we have water seeping from these canals and into our rivers, that is cold water coming in. So not only are we maintaining flow, we're also impacting in-stream temperature, which is very critical for the fisheries. So as we start to consider piping canals like the Crockett Canal, we need to develop management strategies to help maintain the ecosystems of which we are altering by fixing the seepage that is no longer going to make it to the river. So in this case, the Logan River Observatory, we had collected, and a group of my students, we had collected quite a bit of data. And from this, we were able to actually start to understand what was happening in the system in the current environment in terms of temperature. We built an in-stream temperature model, and what you can see here is that we have temperature on the y-axis, and then we actually have distance downstream from the water lab to all the way down to Menden Road, if you know this area. And what you can see is that at the water lab, and this is under current scenarios where we know how much water from that seepage study I showed you and all of our measurements, we can predict the temperature given all of those different inflows. And you'll see that at the water lab, between the water lab and the Crockett diversion, we are increasing the temperature. Then we go further downstream. We've taken a bunch of water out at this point. You can see another increase in temperature pretty quickly. And then we just keep kind of stepping up. There is some flattening out below Crockett diversion where some of these cold water inflows come in. That's a useful thing. And then as we get down towards the Little Logan that's labeled there, we now are starting to bump up against the in-stream water quality standard. This is important for fisheries because that level, the water body becomes impaired, and the cold water fishery standard is now no longer being met. So what does this have to do with the piping? Well, the question is, what happens as we take away all the seepage in this area? It turns out that they are trying to design alternatives where they are going to add an additional 20 cubic feet per second into the river. And the question was, and maintain that extra flow in the river as a way to offset the seepage that it will no longer be there. And the question was, what are the impacts on temperature as we look at these different alternatives? And in this plot, I've just added 2 alternatives. They have a difference in where they actually divert the water from the system, but you will see that the brown and the yellow lines are lower. They result in lower temperatures throughout the entire system. And it turns out that we do not exceed the water quality standard anymore by just keeping more water in the river. So while we're changing the hydrology by decreasing the seepage from this canal, we're actually keeping more water in stream as a way to offset that. And this becomes really important, an important example of how a functioning observatory can facilitate local needs to make sure that we're maintaining ecosystems and meeting the needs of the agricultural diverters. The Logan River Observatory also provides research for statewide planning tools. This is the world according to engineers. The straight line is a river, bear with me. The dots, or the circles, those are small reservoirs. This is first, second, and third dam. If you look at the different locations that we have gauging stations, you will see that, and this is just in the managed section of the Logan River, you'll see that we have gauging stations at many locations along the main stem Logan. And this is important for helping us keep track of what is moving through, the amount of water that's moving through the Logan. Note that there are 2 different locations that are a little bit lighter. Those are gauging stations that should be coming online this fall. Additionally, we have gauged any major inflows. This includes Spring Creek and the Blacksmith Fork River. And we are going to be gauging this, again this fall, DeWitt Springs overflow that is a major spring system that is actually the drinking water source for Logan. In addition, we've been working with the Division of Water Rights to ensure that the diversion gauging systems that they have, that they are collecting data at the same time step and the same frequency as the Logan River Observatory. So now we can start to look at the entire system, what's being diverted, what's left in the river, and how that changes as you move through the whole system. And again, this provides an opportunity to illustrate our abilities and limitations for tracking water through these highly managed systems, because tracking water is going to become more and more of a management issue. So the Logan River Observatory does not just collect data. We also support and train students and staff that basically provide expertise that will help different state, local, and federal agencies when needed. I'm going to provide just a couple of quick examples. So this figure is, the fuzzy things are trees. This is a section of the Logan River between Park Avenue and 10th West. This shows a top view of the river, and the colors in the river show the amount of solar heating or solar radiation reaching the river. So this says something about the potential for the river warming. The trees themselves, you can see, are covering this section of the river quite well. The Department of Transportation had planned to remove all the trees on the north and assumed that by removing these trees, they would have limited influence on the temperature or the solar heating, because it's on the north side and there's not that much radiation that would be hitting this section of the river. So one of my students took the time and made sure that he asked questions. He actually modeled this, and he showed that when you remove those trees on the north side, all of a sudden you have a lot of red, which shows significant solar warming, even though it's on the north, because of just the angle of the sun, and this is during the summer. So we suggested that perhaps instead of removing all the trees in this remediation project, they were trying to remediate wetlands, and they, in the process, removed some invasive species. We said rather than removing all the trees, leave a 20-foot buffer. And we did the analysis to show that by leaving a 20-foot buffer, that we now minimize additional solar warming associated with this remediation project. Again, protecting the river to maintain the ecosystem, but also meet the needs of the other people and stakeholders in the watershed. As a very simple example, Hiram Dam in 2023, there were some concerns about the integrity of the spillway of Hiram Dam, but they were moving a lot of water through there. They had somebody sitting out there kind of watching and monitoring this whole system, and they realized that they were getting some discrepancies in some of their numbers, and in particular they were concerned that the amount of water that they were releasing from the dam wasn't wasn't accurate, because they just needed to make sure that whatever was going into the system and was going out in the system was appropriate, because otherwise you start to run into the inability to move water fast enough. So we were able to very quickly, a couple of the students that are a student and technician that are here ran out there and provided a measurement and validated that their rating curve at this structure was correct. And all of a sudden it relieved their concerns and it helped them ensure safety for the people who live below this area. Another example of us working with different stakeholders is we are currently working with the Bear River Bird Refuge, where we are helping them develop and test rating curves for their inflow and outflow structures. These managed wetlands are a critical part of what happens to water once it gets near the Great Salt Lake, and there are questions about how much water actually gets through these wetlands to the Great Salt Lake. And this is an example of us working with them and using opportunities out there to do some training and make sure that we are able to better understand water deliveries to the Great Salt Lake. And finally, our experience within the Logan River Observatory has provided insight into various recent projects with the Division of Water Rights. And in particular, we have focused on gauging infrastructure, and infrastructure needs, and hydroinformatics and technology gaps. These two different projects are going to be fundamental to understanding or at least planning what we're going to do in the future in terms of gauging and in terms of data management within the Division of Water Rights. And it's projects like these where hopefully our expertise and the experience that we've had, we can continue to work with groups throughout the state to help figure out how to track flow through our systems, but also to help deal with long-term data management and dissemination strategies for the entire state for our water-related data. So where do we go from here? What have we learned? We've had some time where we've been out and working with lots of different people and some ideas about how best to think about water and think about tracking water. So my first takeaway is we need to think about how we track water differently. We don't want just one measurement location in a watershed. We need to think about what's happening within our watersheds. When it comes to our personal finances, we always want to know our income. We want to know our fees. We know what's in our checking account. We know what's in our savings account. We know what we're investing long term. We know our expenses. And at the end of the month, we want to know our account balances. Well, I would argue we should think of hydrology the same way, where precipitation is our income, the evaporation or evapotranspiration from natural system would be our fees. Our rivers and streams give us some information about what's in our checking account, stuff that tends to move through quickly. Our groundwater storage, that would be our long-term investments. Our savings account would be our reservoir storage, and our expenses would be our consumptive water use. At the end, the hope would be that we understand the short and long-term water availability. If we want to know something about our finances, why wouldn't we want to know something about our water, particularly given the importance of water for development in the state of Utah? Here's the trick here. We struggle to have good estimates of precipitation throughout the state. We also struggle getting estimates of evaporation and evapotranspiration from our natural systems. We have some gauges in our rivers and streams, but they're not fully gauged. Our groundwater storage, again, something that we struggle with because it's very difficult to get at these estimates and they need to be updated. Our consumptive water use is something we're working at getting a better handle on, but something that we, again, need more measurements. And what that means is that we have not a very clear view of what our short and long-term water availability is. This leaves quite a bit of uncertainty in what we have and how to manage that. So my takeaway number 2 is we need to invest in data management, and tools to interface with these data to facilitate our decision making. So not only do we need to make the measurements, we actually need to be able to interface with that data to facilitate any sort of management management decisions in the future. And finally, the last takeaway is that we need to learn to value long-term data and maintain these data streams so that we're prepared when we need this information as our water availability changes. We don't want to wait until we're in a crisis. If we wait until we're in a crisis, we can't go back and get the information we need. I've oftentimes heard, wow, I just wish that we would have known what happened in this year and this year and this year in certain systems, because that would really help with the management decisions that are having to take place now. And I would argue that if we can do this, if we can start to invest in measurements, it's a relatively inexpensive insurance policy. With measurements, we can ensure that we have the water we need and we're able to manage the water that we need to grow and to continue to grow and thrive in the state of Utah. And with that, I would like to just acknowledge a number of people that have been involved in this work. Jeff Horsborough, the Logan River Observatory co-director, he's critical. He has helped deal with all of the data management pieces of this and the development of those hydroinformatics tools. Patrick Strong is the Logan River Observatory technician who has just managed to pull off a miracle with a lot of the gauging that has been done, given the people that he's had to train and the amount of work that has been required. There's also an infinite number of students and technicians and faculty that have been involved in various research projects. And frankly, without our undergraduate students and their involvement as technicians, this also would not have been possible. So thank you all. One last thing about the people or the different funding sources. This is, as I mentioned, this was in part a legislative funded endeavor, but we have been working with the Division of Water Resources with this. The Utah State has also provided some funding, as have Cache Water District and Logan City. And we're looking forward to future work with the Division of Water Rights. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Beth. Wonderful talk. I think a lot of interesting data to think about and what the future may mean in terms of what we need to do for data collection. And so I'm going to open the floor up. Are there questions? Yes. So just raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. I'll bring you the mic so that everyone can hear you.
So I attended Utah State and enjoyed 4 years of drinking the best water in the world there. And I love that with northern Utah. One thing that I heard often when I was living there was Logan doesn't have to worry about water problems because we have so much water. That's a southern Utah thing. I'm wondering, like, as you've been seeing things there, have you seen attitudes change in northern Utah about water supply, or are there still significant challenges in that perception?
That's actually a great question. I have also heard that, and I have spent quite a bit of time trying to help people understand that you can say we have plenty of water, but we don't actually know what our current water situation is. It has not been quantified. And in fact, there's an ongoing study right now where we are looking at the groundwater recharge and use to understand groundwater availability. Because oftentimes when they talk about we've got lots of water, it's in the context of groundwater. And so there's some questions to be answered there, and we need to think about resilience of groundwater. You know, we can say that we have a lot of groundwater right now. The question is, what happens as our snowpack changes? Is our recharge the same? What happens to the amount that we can actually pull from our system, and what does that mean in terms of our rivers, which are oftentimes fed significantly by springs?
I have a number of questions. I'm only going to ask one in the interest of time.
Thanks, Craig.
Yes. Anyhow, what sort of, you've done investigations into measurement. What sort of methods and devices have you investigated?
Well, we have been using primarily, when you're talking about measurements, are you talking about gauging?
Gauging, yes.
Okay, so stream gauging.
Stream gauging, water quantity, that's what I normally deal with.
Okay, so when it comes to water quantity, we are generally just using very traditional methods. We are just applying the methods that the USGS uses everywhere, where we are applying them at a higher density, a higher spatial density. There is the project by Sierra Young, where she's looking at using cameras as a way to get at least relatively good flow measurements with just a camera. And some very fancy computing on the other end. So there are people working on those sorts of projects, but in the observatory, we are just using traditional, well-proven methods to get at flow throughout the watershed. We are also we have tried to look into, we are doing some age dating and other kind of flow path understanding, like sources of water and how it's all connected within the watershed itself, but that is probably not what you're talking about. Yes?
Along with that, have you looked into using the drone cameras?
For?
Velocimetry.
There is some of that work happening in Aggie Air. The tricky part with that is those are typically spot measurements, right? You can get at a location. We are really trying to get over time and space and at a density where we can kind of track what's happening, the ins and the outs and all of that. Yeah.
Can you tell us where to find those studies that you mentioned, the gap analysis and the measuring capacity studies?
Yes.
Where are they? Where do I find them?
So there I am. If you send me an email, there is a HydroShare page that has the measurement and infrastructure gap analysis and all of our findings from that in one location. And if you contact me directly, I would be happy to send that to you.
Representative Bethany, I'm happy to connect you if you just want to shoot me an email.
Thanks, Devin.
I have a question about evapotranspiration. And are you using OpenET at all? Or does satellite data, is that beneficial? And what is the most cutting edge, best opportunity for kind of getting that ET data and putting it into the computer so you can compare it to the real stuff on the ground?
That's a great question. There are some of my colleagues at Utah State are working on OpenET products and have been involved in OpenET development. I can't speak really well about in terms of depth about some of the different ET methods. It's not my area of research. They are trying to, in many different places, put in eddy flux towers to try to get at ways to at least take really good location measurements at certain locations to validate some of the estimates that we're getting from some of our other products in particular. Well, we can talk about remotely sensed products, but also OpenET estimates. So sorry that wasn't a very great answer, but I could tell you who you should talk to.
Thank you. You may have already answered this question with the 3 takeaways of really needing data there. My particular realm of emphasis has to do with landscape and landscape irrigation. How much data, how much information do we have on how the landscape irrigation sector affects the water and how it's getting to the Great Salt Lake?
That's a really great question. Again, one of my colleagues has been working on trying to help figure out good ways to measure that, and there's new requirements that are out there where they are trying to force people to to measure more of what they're within the farm field kind of scale, what they're diverting and then what they're returning, so they can get at some consumptive use values. The details of that, I don't know where that stands right this second, but that is a big push. Our agricultural water use, and even our urban settings, the amount of what we use on our yards, the amount of consumptive use from that is really quite high, right? So that's a big factor here. That is one of the numbers that we really need to get a better handle on, and how we do that. There's some different schools of thought and different efforts that are out there to try to get it at big scales, not just small scales. Yeah. Hi.
Liv Peterson from the Utah Lake Authority. Thanks for a great presentation. I was curious, as I was looking at your last slide there about the quest to figure out what our balance sheet looks like for water. It seems like the water districts would be natural partners for this, and I noticed one of them was a partner that you listed. But what role do you see them playing in engaging and monitoring and measuring?
Wow, that's a great question. I think that they're critical, right? They tend to know what happens with water. I'm not sure. I think that there's probably more that we could understand from them. We've spent some time in meetings with them trying to get at, with the gap analysis study that I mentioned, just working with them trying to understand how all their systems work, because they know their details. And I think that they are critical to this. I'm not sure exactly what that would look like in terms of their involvement, but I don't think we can do it without them. Yeah.
Obviously, hanging upside down has given you lots of room to think about things, and I think that's wonderful. There are many of you contributing to the Great Salt Lake Strike Team effort, which is really a phenomenal source of a resource of insight and input to policy making and management decisions. How are you feeling about your traction with the work that you're doing collectively? And I guess I'm asking you to speak collectively on behalf of the strike team, which is really risky. But how are you feeling in terms of the beneficial translation of your cohort of researchers and agencies working on behalf of raising elevation about Great Salt Lake and water and all of those things that are impacting it?
Well, to speak for the entire Great Salt Lake Strike Team, I can't do. I could provide my thoughts on progress. I am impressed with the amount of progress that has been made in terms of our change in thought process. We are thinking about water differently. I think we are valuing water more. We have made great strides, and I'm going to say the collective we in the state of Utah at implementing a lot of different policies to help facilitate that. I think we have more work to do. I think that there is, we are continuing to unravel the complexity of it all to figure out what the key different steps are that have to be made that will make the most difference. There's a million things that could be done. The question is what's most important and what's the order of operation. And so I think we are making progress. Can I put a number on it? No. In all the conversations that I've had with people around the state at different levels and in different sectors, I have way more hope than I think that I thought I would have, because I am seeing change, and it may not be perfectly visible all the time, but there is so much happening behind the scenes. Our state agencies, they're killing it, but it doesn't always get shown to the public. And so there's a communication issue there, but there is a lot happening, and I think that we are going to be able to kind of wrap our arms around this and figure out methods to resolve this in the best way possible.
So a couple of years ago, when the Great Salt Lake dropped to its lowest point, and all of a sudden there was this, explosion of, people being worried about water.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember the exact number. It was something that Governor Cox sent out, saying something to the effect that Utahns have saved 9 billion gallons of water, with all of these, and that number's probably wrong. So, but it was a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you think of numbers, 9 billion, that seems like a big number. And my thought at the time was, that's all great, but where's that water going?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm glad to hear about all the work that's being done. My question, I guess, would be when you're speaking to different players in the game, whether they be municipalities or Forest Service, I mean, you name it, all the different players, like irrigation districts. I think the perception has changed, but do you see their desire to save this water, or as a way to push more people into the state and to be able to provide for that, or is it more along the lines of let's try and keep the ecosystems healthy? Is it somewhere in the middle? I'm just kind of curious what those conversations perhaps have been like.
I definitely don't have a complete cross-section of thoughts. The people that I have worked with, the goal is to get water to the lake. And I'm a water person, so I probably don't deal with the developmental sector that much, right? So I don't think that people are thinking, let's save water so we can use more water. They're really trying to save water to get more water to the lake. Now, there are some unintended consequences to some decisions that are being made where it may not all decisions will perfectly translate into water to the lake. There are some situations where an attempt at saving water may actually translate into increasing water consumption. And we're trying to figure out how to avoid some of those pitfalls. So I think that generally speaking, the people that I have interfaced with, they're not out to just provide for growth. Their goal is to actually deliver water to the lake. The state, the Great Salt Lake Commissioner, all the different state agencies, they take the potential human health threats, the dust problems, the ecosystems, they take it all very seriously, and their objective is to make sure that we can somehow come up with solutions that translate into a good, healthy situation for us all to live and grow in. But I haven't heard it focused on growth.
Or at a point, or maybe we've got time for one more question. Is there one more out there? Yes, in the back of the room.
Do you know if these kinds of studies are taking place in other rivers and streams in the state of Utah? So those of us that maybe live in different parts of the state can look at data. I'm specifically thinking of the Narrows on the Jordan River, where you have 8 canals that divert from that site and pretty much drain the river dry, and then it starts to pick up water upstream or downstream, I guess.
That's very common. Almost all rivers do that in the summer. There are a lot of different gauging stations along the Jordan, and most of those diversions have real-time gauges on them. There is not an equivalent Logan River Observatory for the Jordan, but a lot of data is being collected. So what is difficult, I think, as the public, is how do you access those data and how do you pull them together? And that is something where our hope is that this is where the state, and when it comes to data management, it's not that the data aren't there, it's that it's very difficult to pull all the different sources of data together. And this is where future data management and collective water data management could make it so those tools are much more, we're accessing those data well and making them available to people that don't know how to download a whole bunch of different data from different sources of different time step and compile them and then try to figure out where they are. And it's not that easy. It's hard. So the hope is that we are headed in a direction to make it so not everybody has a Logan River Observatory or needs a Logan River Observatory. We are trying to get those public-facing tools just to pull data in and make it so it's just easier for everybody to access the data that are available and any new data that we have. Yeah.
Let's give Dr. Neilson some
Thank you.